Gunfire cracked in the tunnels. Shouts ricocheted in stone corridors. Ezekiel's voice rose above it, half sermon, half rage, calling on judgment, promising fire and cleansing. Caleb and Josiah attacked with savage desperation, using shadowed alcoves to strike and slip away. But the rescuers pressed forward, chamber by chamber, until the fight turned and the sons fell back bleeding. Above ground, flames burst suddenly from the house. Temperance, cornered and frantic, had set fire to the structure, perhaps to destroy evidence, perhaps to die rather than surrender. The fire spread quickly, roaring up dry beams and collapsing parts of the floor. With smoke choking the tunnels and escape paths narrowing, the remaining Hardens finally ceased their struggle. They were dragged into the cool night as the house burned to its foundations. Only Mercy surrendered without combat. She was found kneeling beside her bed, hands folded, waiting for consequence. What followed shook the frontier in ways that would reverberate for decades. The cave system beneath the Harden farm proved larger than anyone dared imagine. Nearly 2 miles of interconnected caverns and chambers, dug and shaped slowly through years of clandestine labor. It took days to catalog the remains inside. Authorities found not just the 67 victims Mercy recorded, but signs of many more. Fragmented bones in unreachable crevices, small garments that spoke of children, crude wooden toys never reclaimed by tiny hands. The Henley family, Jonathan, Elizabeth, and their 2 children, had been held alive for days after the blizzard before meeting their end. The children's remains were found separate from their parents. Searchers wept openly as they carried the small bundles into daylight. In late June 1799, the Harden family stood trial in Lexington. Spectators filled the courthouse day after day. Some had lost kin along the wilderness road. Others came drawn by the grim magnetism of such an unprecedented case. Ezekiel Harden behaved not like a man accused, but like a prophet scorned. His testimony was a delirium of scripture twisted into justification, the murders sanctified as holy duty, the chambers as courts of God, the stolen goods as righteous wages. Temperance claimed coercion, as did the sons, but the ledgers, the trophies, the shared handwriting made lies of their pleas. Only Mercy spoke plainly. Her voice carried shame rather than madness. Her cooperation earned her life in prison rather than the noose. On August 15, 1799, exactly 1 year after Samuel Fletcher vanished, Ezekiel, Temperance, Caleb, and Josiah Harden were hanged before a crowd the state had never seen before. Ezekiel's final words were curses masquerading as prophecy. His wife and sons died silent. The farm was burned again, reduced to ash. The caves were sealed with stone and gunpowder, and the land was left to grow wild. No one has lived on that soil since. But the legacy of the Harden murders did not remain underground. New laws followed, procedures for missing travelers, requirements for land purchase verification, scrutiny toward those who claimed too much virtue. Communities learned to temper trust with vigilance. Historians, granted limited access to the sealed records in the early 19th century, found patterns that suggested the Hardens might not have been alone. Clusters of disappearances near other charitable households in neighboring states hinted at a wider, darker frontier truth. But the complete files, the ones unsealed only in 1987, revealed how much had been deliberately hidden. And even now, many believe the caves beneath Beaver Creek hold more secrets than the state has ever admitted. What do you think lies still buried in Kentucky's soil? Were the Harden crimes truly contained? Or were they only the first we ever discovered? If you want the final part of this story, Just tell me when you're ready." A traveling surveyor named William Patterson had been taken 3 days before and was to face judgment the next night. And he wasn't alone. 2 others, a young woman, Rebecca Foster, missing for a week, and an elderly preacher, Luther Grimby, were being held in separate chambers. Mercy said she confided now only because she feared her father had begun to see enemies where none existed. He'd spoken of purging neighbors who asked too many questions. He had mentioned Isaac Brewster by name. Worst of all, Mercy said, his eyes had begun to linger on her with the same cold appraisal he'd used on so many travelers. She believed she was next. Winters felt the room tighten around him. There was no time for warrants, no time for distance or procedure. By Mercy's testimony, at least 3 people were waiting in darkness beneath the Harden farm, condemned by a madman's doctrine, and the hourglass was already half spent. He couldn't ride for reinforcements, not without signing those captives' death warrants, and a confrontation alone would be suicide. But the frontier was not without men who understood danger. Henrik Johansson did not hesitate when approached. Winters saw the grim light of purpose settle into his features, the look of a man who had long suspected and now felt confirmation like a weight on the sternum. Isaac Brewster, shaken by memories of Tennessee, joined them without hesitation. Benjamin Stokes, a former bounty hunter familiar with the terrain of violence, volunteered. Daniel Crawford, who had fought in more than one desperate Indian skirmish, agreed too. The plan they formed was brutally simple: reach the farm under darkness, breach the underground chambers, extract the prisoners, and contain the Hardens by any means the situation demanded. Mercy provided what details she could. 2 entrances, the main access through the vast root cellar and a concealed exit in the woods. Weapon caches placed where one would expect them to be, choke points carved into the tunnels for defense. Her father had rehearsed escape plans for years, she said, drills that were practiced with the same devotional rhythm as prayer. The 6 men moved under moonless sky. Johansson mapped a path through creek beds and black undergrowth, avoiding open ground. The air smelled of early summer, warm and heavy, but beneath it lay another scent, faint but unmistakable, lime and the old dampness of disturbed earth. When they reached the ridge overlooking the Harden farm, they saw lights flickering between the buildings. They heard the faint pulse of metal striking stone, and, just at the edge of hearing, the low, fractured echo of a voice crying out, then breaking into silence. At precisely 2 a.m, they advanced. The root cellar's entrance was no simple farming structure. It had been fortified, framed with thick beams, its descent angled and deep. Ezekiel had built it for endurance, not storage. But he had not built it for a surprise that came silently from above. Winters and Johansson slipped down the steps, while Stokes and Crawford circled to intercept the concealed exit. Brewster remained with the horses, rifle ready. Deep inside the limestone belly of the farm, the lamps burned with a sickly yellow glow. What they found, as they moved deeper, made Mercy's confession seem mercifully incomplete. William Patterson was chained upright in a cell barely large enough for his body. His eyes opened when the men approached. The relief there was sharp enough to wound. Rebecca Foster lay on a pallet, barely conscious. Luther Grimby gasped weakly as they lifted him. Their rescue brought no resistance, yet. But farther inside, the chambers widened into a cold archive of horror. Bones, some fresh, some brittle, lay in ordered heaps. Clothing scraps hung from pegs. Personal items were stacked in niches. The ledgers Mercy described sat on a table marked with candle wax and fingerprints. lists of lives itemized with dreadful calm. And in Ezekiel's courtroom, relics taken from victims glimmered like trophies. Rings, watches, edged tools, scalps stiffened by time. It was here the Hardens fought. In Ezekiel's world, every traveler carried a flaw that could be sanctified into guilt. The wealthy were condemned for greed, scholars and doctors for pride, ministers for hidden arrogance or doctrinal impurity. Families that traveled with young children were charged with endangering innocence, and those who hesitated to share their business or questioned Ezekiel's probing were judged secret sinners, wolves in the garments of pilgrims. Once judged, the family moved with the precision of a single organism. They extended hospitality with the softness of angels. Warm meals, comfortable bedding, skillful conversation meant to lower suspicion. And in the final cup of coffee or generous pour of whiskey, temperance would add the tincture she had perfected, a blend of herbs that made a man's limbs heavy, his thoughts fog, his strength leak slowly away. By the time a traveler excused himself to rest for the night, his fate had already been sealed. When he awoke, he was deep underground. Mercy described the chambers beneath the farm, rooms hollowed from limestone, reinforced over years with timber and stone, stretching nearly 200 yards beneath the property. What began long ago as a root cellar had been carved and expanded into a labyrinth. At the heart of it lay the chamber Ezekiel called his courtroom. Stone walls hung with distorted religious symbols, iron shackles bolted into the rock, and a carved limestone bench where Ezekiel declared he rendered divine justice. Winters listened, motionless, as Mercy explained how captives were dragged, often still groggy, before her father. He conducted trials that were nothing but sermons sharpened into sentences. Sometimes he read scripture as though the passages demanded blood. Sometimes he spoke as if he were the only barrier between the frontier and the corruption that threatened it. And always, the verdict had already been decided before a traveler took one step inside the house. Those marked as useful were kept alive. Weeks, months, while their knowledge or skills were taken from them. Dr. Cromwell, Mercy said, had trained her mother in surgical procedures during his captivity. Reverend Cross had written sermons for Ezekiel under duress. Skilled craftsmen taught techniques Ezekiel coveted. When their usefulness ended, so did their lives. Others died within hours, by rope, by water, by wounds inflicted and managed with medical precision. Ezekiel assigned each method according to what he deemed a victim's sins demanded. Wealthy merchants faced elaborate deaths. Those who questioned his theology met harsher ends. Ezekiel spoke of these acts as purifications. Temperance administered the pain with a healer's steady hands. Caleb and Josiah performed the physical labors, capturing victims, maintaining the subterranean structure, transporting bodies through deeper caves connected to the farthest chambers. And Mercy, her voice cracked when she reached this part, served as the record keeper. Her neat handwriting, shaped in childhood by school books and scripture, filled ledger after ledger with the most meticulous inventory a murderer could devise. Names, ages, possessions, final words, method of death. Her hands shook as she told Winters she had recorded 67 victims. She told him bodies were never buried on the farm. They were carried through the hidden limestone corridors, some so deep that lanterns burned low for want of oxygen, and left in chambers far from any man's path. Clothing was divided, useful garments kept, distinctive pieces destroyed. Money and valuables were taken to distant counties and sold. Belongings were scattered along the road to suggest robbery or Indian attack. Horses, the most dangerous evidence of all, were funneled through traders who never asked questions. Their charity, Mercy said, had been part of the deception. Every life Temperance saved, every time Ezekiel comforted a grieving family, the town folded the Hardens deeper into trust. Their goodness wasn't merely a mask, it was a strategy. Mercy knelt on Winter's floor as she finished speaking, as though the truth itself required penance. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She barely breathed. She simply whispered the last part, the reason she'd risked coming. Another captive was underground, alive, near the Holston River, Brewster said. Travelers had been vanishing between 1789 and 1791. The suspected household, the Harpers, had been respected pillars of their valley. A lay preacher patriarch with a powerful voice, a small, delicate wife skilled in herbs and healing, and 3 grown children. They had arrived in the region with no verifiable past. Refugees, they said, from some calamity, and they quickly built a reputation for charity and religious zeal. Then the bodies, shallow graves found in the woods, personal items of the missing uncovered among them. The family had fled overnight. Their farm was found burned, wells filled, tools destroyed, as if every trace had been deliberately erased. Warrants issued, searches conducted. The remains of numerous victims were found in shallow graves and animal bones scattered in patterns that shouted careful disposal. The Harpers slipped away like a ghost, leaving a record that did not square with the hometown virtues they'd displayed. Brewster's physical description of the Harper family sent a cold wave through Winters. The patriarch's tall, penetrating presence, the small, skilled female healer, the ages and temperaments of the children, so close to Ezekiel, Temperance, Caleb, Josiah, and Mercy Harden that the overlap could not be ignored. The Tennessee case had been closed by the authorities of the day in a mixture of failure and relief. The family had vanished, the evidence was raw and local memory fragmented. Brewster confessed to Winters he had felt guilt for not pursuing the trail then. He had traded in rumors and left the rest buried. To come to Millfield, to hear the same pattern unfolding again, had pricked at a conscience that had long kept accounts in the dark. The implication in Brewster's account made Winters' world suddenly wider and colder. The Hardens might be more than opportunistic murderers. They could be a practiced group, experienced, mobile, changing their faces when suspicion sharpened, moving like a disease across a frontier of trust. If Brewster's story was true, the killings in Kentucky were not local aberrations. They were perhaps a later chapter in an old, learned method. Even with Brewster's testimony and the neighbors' observations, Winters knew the law required more than pattern and anecdote. Courts demanded things that would not be swayed by inference. He needed an admission. He needed a ledger that named names. He needed a body with cause. Evidence that would not be misinterpreted or dismissed as coincidence. He began to watch the farm more closely, to time the comings and goings, to note the hours of work and the nights when the lamps burned low against a winter wind. He moved slow, as a man who knows how easily a life could be unraveled if cut at the wrong place. And then, on a night in late May, a figure appeared at Winter's cabin like something made of moonlight and fear, pale, trembling, soaked with terror. She would speak for hours, and what she said would tear a seam in the cultivated innocence of the county and uncover a gravity so monstrous that the tiny town could scarcely bear its shape. She arrived past midnight, bareheaded and mud-spattered, her breath trembling in thin, uneven gasps. For a moment, Constable Winters thought she might collapse on the threshold. Then the lamplight caught her face, and he saw what fear can carve into a human being. Mercy Harden, once the quiet beauty of Millfield, looked like someone who had outrun death and wasn't sure it hadn't followed her here. She didn't wait to be invited inside. She stepped across the threshold, as if stepping out of one life and into another. Her hands shook uncontrollably, but her voice, when she forced it into the air, carried a clarity Winters recognized from testimonies given by the newly bereaved. The family, she said, had been killing travelers for 8 years. She spoke as though each word cost her something irretrievable. Her confession unraveled into the room with a trembling, merciless detail no one in Millfield would have imagined possible. She told Winters of the evaluation, the quiet, careful probing her father used on weary travelers who stopped at the farm, the way he studied them as if peering through bone and sinew into their souls. Ezekiel called it discerning the unworthy. He asked about lineage, faith, business, family ties, always with that gentle piety people praised him for, while behind his eyes he weighed a stranger's fate. 9-year-old Timothy Varan, who spent more of his days in the woods than at the dining table, came to Constable Winters with a story that seemed at first the sort of thing adults dismissed as imagination. He said he had been wandering near Beaver Creek on nights when the wind was a thin, silver thing and the moon hid behind clouds, and that he had heard screaming. Not a single human cry of surprise or anger, the quick, bright sounds one hears in an accident, but long, ragged keening that rose and fell as though a voice were being broken in rhythm. The sounds came in the darkest hours, Timothy insisted, and they were sometimes accompanied by other noises night cannot easily make sense of. The clink of metal on stone, the creaking of ropes, an odd, unsteady chanting that might have been a prayer or a hymn warped into something else by distance and fear. Adults had shrugged, animals cried at night, wind played tricks. Yet when Winters pressed the boy for dates, Timothy gave answers precise enough to chill a practical man. The nights he remembered corresponded almost exactly with the estimated times that other travelers had vanished. The coincidence cut through the constable like a cold blade. A childish fancy could not so neatly map onto so many disappearances. Winters began to listen as much as he questioned. He moved through the neighborhood with a watchful patience, asking quiet questions of those who lived within hearing distance of the Harden farm. The answers, when gathered like shards of glass, created a reflection flattened and jagged. Sarah Mitchell, whose little plot lay closest to the Harden fence line, remembered lanterns moving between the outbuildings at hours when decent folk were asleep. She had heard digging that went on until dawn for weeks. At the time, she had accepted Temperance's excuse: night labor to avoid hot days in summer, an explanation dressed in reason, and the farm's reputation for thrift. But later she recalled the sounds were later and deeper than ordinary garden work, that the piles of excavated earth she assumed would be nearby were never where they should have been, and that sometimes muffled voices or what might have been cries threaded the noise. Henrik Johansson, the Swedish tracker whose skill was spoken of in the county like a minor miracle, offered a darker observation. Along the fence where his land met the Hardens, he had found bone fragments, not the clean scraps of animals picked apart by dogs and weather, but pieces that bore saw marks and signs of deliberate fracture. Some bones showed evidence of boiling or other treatment that suggested human processing rather than natural scavenging. When he had mentioned this to Ezekiel, the patriarch had shrugged and blamed a recent bout of diseased livestock and the cruelty of winter. But Henrik's eye, the long, patient study of a man who read the land as a ledger, knew the difference. Neighbors also noticed changes in the Hardens themselves. The children, once bright and sociable, had grown tight-lipped and secretive. Caleb and Josiah moved through the town with a watchful caution that made their old friends uneasy. Mercy Harden, once the county's admired beauty, had the look of someone who had been forced to carry a weight too heavy for her years. Hollowed cheeks, a haunted blankness in her eyes, a voice that pulled back as if sound itself might betray her. Ezekiel's sermons shifted. Where he had once wedded mercy and rebuke, he now favored thunder. His preaching returned again and again to themes of judgment, of purging sin with decisive violence. Some who attended whispered that his words had become less a call to grace than a drumbeat for something darker. Winters gathered these bits without speaking of them aloud. To accuse a family so woven into the town's life would require iron proof. The Hardens' cooperation with searches and their visible aid in the hunt for the missing made accusations appear monstrous. Moreover, the frontier's long, bitter ledger of loss, wolves, accidents, illness, Indian raids, gave every disappearance a plausible secular explanation. Yet statistics, Winters thought, were a kind of truth too. A cluster of vanishings so tightly centered around one estate could not be mere happenstance. His private inquiries reached beyond the immediate hollow. In April of 1799, a peddler named Isaac Brewster arrived in Millfield with stories that added a cold, regional geometry to Winters' fears. Brewster, a man who trafficked in news as much as in cheap tinware, had spent the winter on trade routes farther south and east. He spoke of a farm in eastern Tennessee, years earlier, where a family called Harper had been suspected of exactly the sort of disappearances now haunting Millfield. The pattern Brewster described was not similar. It was nearly identical. The first public alarm came on October 13, 1798, when Samuel Fletcher failed to arrive in Lexington. Fletcher was not a casual traveler. He was a seasoned merchant who moved twice a year between Virginia and Kentucky, consistent to the point of predictability. When his partner, Thomas Greeley, received no word 5 days after his expected arrival, a practical fear took root. Greeley traced Fletcher's route back from Lexington. Innkeepers and farmers confirmed Fletcher had passed through on schedule. Then the trail thinned and stopped near Millfield. They found Fletcher's bay mare at noon on the second day, grazing, saddle in place, bridled hung neatly on a low branch, the animal well fed as if tended. Fletcher's saddlebags were intact. A leather pouch with nearly $50 in silver, wealth enough to make a man a mark, remained undisturbed. The coins ruled out robbery as motive. Personal effects lay in a deliberate line away from the road toward the woods, as if someone had forced the man from his horse and dragged him into the trees, but then erased him from the earth. Constable Jacob Winters, a hardened ex-sergeant of the Continental Army, organized a search. His men followed torn fabric, blood spatters, a definite trail toward the Harden property, and then nothing. At the boundary of the farm, where a good law and a good neighbor should have saved a man's life, the sign of Fletcher's passage vanished. The tracks stopped as though a hand had lifted him clear of the world. Even the best tracker in the county, Henrik Johansson, admitted the trail's end was like a failure of nature to notice. Ezekiel Harden's account was plain and predictable. Fletcher had stopped at their house near sunset, refused a bed, took a supposed shortcut to Lexington, and rode off. Temperance had offered medicine for a stomach complaint. Caleb had offered escort. The merchant had insisted on pressing on. The story, finalized in identical words by each family member, was too well formed. Winchester felt the rehearsed quality of it, the way one feels a song that's been practiced until feeling has been erased. More than the polished testimony, Winters noticed changes in the farm. An enlarged root cellar with new timber, a new stone smokehouse, fresh earth shoved near outbuildings as though something vast had been buried. Ezekiel explained harvest profits and thrift. The family's hospitality continued to shine, merciful, comforting, eager to help search parties. The constable had nothing concrete to hold, and so the official finding drifted toward the ordinary hazards of the road. Robbery, a wolf, a bad turn. Fletcher's horse was sold. His life diminished to stories, but the disappearances did not stop. Over the winter and into spring, every 2 or 3 weeks, another traveler vanished along that same corridor. Merchant wagons, solitary men, families traveling together, men of different ages, faiths, and means, fell out of the map. Dr. Marcus Cromwell's overturned wagon near Devil's Fork yielded instruments missing, a surgical bag gone. The Henley family's wagon was recovered cleaned and emptied of people, food, and tools left behind, while clothing and personal items vanished. Reverend Nathan Cross's ministries, donations strapped to his saddle, remained intact when his horse was found. Each case bore the same signature: abandoned horses, scattered belongings, last known inquiries about directions to the Harden farm, and trails that dissolved at the property line. Constable Winters found himself hemmed between suspicion and social peril. The Hardens were pillars, sermons that drew crowds, healings credited with saving lives, a public face that would ruin a man who accused them without ironclad proof. Winters understood frontier justice's precarious currency: evidence. In a place where disappearance could be explained by cold, wolf, or bandit, statistics were a poor substitute for a corpse. Yet the cluster of vanishings clustered around the farm like thunderheads gathering, and the state of unease widened into a community's quiet dread. Small anomalies, the lanterns seen moving at night, the grinding of earth in odd hours, the smell of lime in the air, grew into whispers. Neighbors who once passed the Harden gate without thought now found themselves watching its shadows. The first fissure in the Harden facade came from a child. In the autumn of 1798, 17 travelers simply ceased to exist along a 20-mile scar of wilderness road in southeastern Kentucky. Horses were left grazing, saddles sat upright on empty beasts. Bundles of belongings lay scattered in the leaf litter as though their owners had stepped aside for a moment and never returned. There were no footprints that led away, no torn clothing that might tell of a struggle, only absences so precise they felt deliberate. What made those vanishings colder than any winter was not merely their number, but the way the world around them closed ranks. Records of the investigation were quietly sealed. Official pages, affidavits, even casual mentions in county minutes were buried as if by command. The truth about the Harden family farm, about what lay beneath its wholesome veneer, remained locked away for nearly 2 centuries, until a county clerk in 1987 opened a file long thought forgotten and brought into light a crime so systematic it reshaped the idea of violence on the frontier. Southeastern Kentucky in 1798 sat on a seam between 2 landscapes: the civilized world people remembered, and the wilderness they were trying to remake. The Wilderness Road, cut through Cumberland Gap decades earlier by Daniel Boone and others, had become the main artery for the westward drift. It wound 200 miles through ridges and hollows, along creek beds and narrow saddles where a single misstep could mean exposure or worse. Along that artery, tiny settlements sprouted like islands: rough log stores, a church, an inn. Each served as a brief sanctuary for travelers, a place to trade, to rest, to gather news before the next stage of danger. Millfield sat at a twist in that road where the trail dropped into the Beaver Creek Valley. 300 souls, give or take, tucked into a hollow where everybody believed they knew everybody else. The town had been founded in 1794 by Virginia Baptists seeking freedom and a new life. Their mark was visible everywhere: mandatory Sunday services, a town council that regulated dances and drink, a careful, pious watchfulness that passed for civility. Hendrick's General Store anchored the settlement, a weathered log building of rough planks and business sense. Jeremiah Hendriss, a man who had carried a musket under Daniel Boone, ran it with a judge's patience and a trader's eye. The Cumberland Inn, a two-story house of weathered clapboard maintained by a widow from Philadelphia, offered hot meals and beds to those who could pay 2 bits for the comfort of civilization. The New Jerusalem Baptist Church, a low log room, gathered the whole town each Sunday. Reverend Ephraim Cole, a Harvard-trained minister turned frontier missionary, delivered sermons that mixed scripture with practical advice for survival. Among the town's ostensibly upright families were the Hardens, Ezekiel and Temperance and their 3 grown children, Caleb, Josiah, and Mercy. They had arrived in the spring of 1791, claiming to be refugees from Indian raids in eastern Virginia. They planted themselves into Millfield's life with a speed that looked like providence. Ezekiel acted as a lay preacher, Temperance directed charitable healing for the needy, and their children performed the roles expected of a model frontier family: labor, schoolmastering in winter, gentle society. People spoke of them in tones reserved for the respectable. Ezekiel's voice could fill the church. Temperance's hands mended broken bones and midwifed new lives. The farm produced corn and tobacco in quantities that seemed disproportionate to the family's publicly known labor. The Harden farm spread across 400 acres of bottomland on Beaver Creek, 3 miles south of Millfield. Its house was a 2-story log structure with glass windows and stone chimneys, luxuries on the frontier. The barns and outbuildings were numerous. A grist mill whispered along the creek. A root cellar and smokehouse gave the impression of a family thinking beyond mere subsistence. Visitors remarked quietly, with the mixture of admiration and curiosity that accompanies prosperity in a thinly peopled land. The Hardens had goods and comforts strangers lacked. Their generosity toward travelers became part of their reputation. Wagon parties were steered toward Beaver Creek by local guides who promised fair supplies, a warm meal, a bed. Mercy kept a guest book. Names accumulated: merchants, ministers, families, solitary men, all recorded under the same careful ink. In a place where law was thin and nights long, hospitality was as vital as a good rifle. The Hardens appeared to give it freely. Temperance tended the sick without asking coin. Ezekiel rode out in storms to help a broken wagon. The family sheltered the stranded and guided the nervous. Such deeds were, in the community's eyes, Christian duty magnified. But on the frontier, where trust could be the difference between life and death, appearances were also weapons.